Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with another class examination. This one is the Death Knight, which is the combination of Soldier and Necromancer. Now, this, in terms from the point of view of the Soldier class's perspective, this is something of an interesting build. Because not a whole lot of the skills of the Soldier, at least the damaging abilities, translate well into Necromancer and vice versa. There's not a whole lot of overlap here beyond the passives. And even then, for that matter, mostly it's the Soldier's passives that effectively overlap with the Necromancer, not so much the other way around. The problem here, and the reason why this is because the Soldier, again, which you all pretty much know very well by now, the Soldier does physical, pierce, internal trauma damage, some bleeding. Potentially some elemental if you decide to go into Discord for Cadence. That's about it. That's all it's got. Percentage of health damage. Wow. Wow. That's all. That's all it's got. Necromancer has bleeding, sure, in the form of blood boil. That's fine, but it doesn't actually enhance bleeding damage, so that's very minor. Beyond that, you've got Vitality, Aether, Cold, some pierce damage, and that's about it. So there's not a whole lot of damage overlap between the two classes. So essentially, you're running on, broadly speaking, two different ideas. The first idea is going full pets, and this is going to be very interesting, but this actually works really well, so don't underestimate this. This is one of my favorite ways of building a full pet. It's pretty fun. You just go right into these. You go all the way. Yeah, call the grave, there it is. Absolutely bust out everything here. Actually, we probably, yeah. Now, this is just roughly how you can do it. I don't actually normally build Reap Spirit. You can. I know a lot of people are really fond of this. Personally, a bit expensive for my tastes, and I'm not hugely fond of the Wraith in the first place. Wraith, or what is it, Reaper? Reap Spirit, Sundered Wraith, whatever. You know what I mean. And usually I'll go into military conditioning instead. But really, essentially, you can go into a full pet build using Field Command, Squad Tactics, and then whatever of these passives you particularly want. You don't necessarily need to go into all the pets. Actually, sometimes I don't go into the Blight Fiend because he isn't always necessarily what I'm looking for, but you are almost always going to go into the skeletons, because the squad tactics here, increasing the casting speed and the attack speed, means your skeletons are going to go absolutely ballistic. Generally speaking, again, this is something you don't necessarily have to go into, but I usually go into Bone Harvest so that way I can, and I'll usually go into Harvester of Death too, because I'm bold like that, because you at least want to be doing something. You don't want to just be standing there hitting people feebly. Besides the fact, boosting the damage of your pets even further with Soul Harvest is a pretty good time. So, you could also go with the skeletons and the Wraith if you really want to. That's totally up to you. I mean, essentially speaking, at minimum, you want Bone Harvest, full skeletons, Master of Death. You'll want Field Command, and then beyond Field Command, you can go with pretty much whatever you want that you're comfortable with. Menhir's Will if you want to stay alive. Overguard if you really want to. Overguard is great if you're going with a full pet. Obviously, military conditioning, of course. Shield training if you want to go with the shield. Again, normally I go with a two-handed weapon. So, usually I'm going to go with Menhir's Will and military conditioning so I don't die. So let me go with my usual. This assumes I don't have any items that enhance something specific, because then I'll kind of lean towards that direction in that particular circumstance. So, and yeah, I would probably do Call of the Grave over the other one. Well, no, I would actually probably go with the Sundered Wraith at this particular junction, actually. So you can absolutely do that. Actually, it would probably be slightly better to do this. You can do this, but this really can boost up your pets quite a lot. But yeah, if you want a Necromancer focused side of this, you're going pets. You could alternatively do a really interesting and fascinating. By the way, there are certain shields that boost pets for Necromancer as well, so don't feel like you're locked into a two-handed weapon. It's just how I usually play this, how I prefer to play this particular build, but that's, again, personal preference. There are really great shields for this combination that you can do some pretty amazing things with. But that's an absolutely fantastic time. But if you are going to go with a pet build with this combination, guaranteed skeletons at minimum. Even if you only take the skeletons as your only pets, it's still a very effective pet build. Alternatively, you can go really heavy on a couple of different Necromancer styles of play. You can go Harbinger of Souls, and then you can, I don't know, go into Drain Essence is really good if you're going into Harbinger. I don't usually go into Siphon because it's either going to be Vitality or Aether damage, and this increases both. There's a slight preference for Vitality. If you want to, or if you have something that increases Siphon Souls, absolutely go into that. I almost always go into Ravenous Earth because the Foul Eruption is stupid strong. It's just an amazing time. And of course, Spectral Binding, Spectral Wrath. Now, this is actually something I really want to talk about here. Hold on one second. This is an interesting time, because if you can get yourself the sustainable energy regeneration of your dreams, then you can self-sustain for what could only be described as grotesquely long periods of time. And this is what a lot of people talk about when they say, oh, you know, the Soldier Necromancer is one of the most defensive classes in the game. Well, yes and no. You do have to be paying some attention to that. But overall, you do have absolutely fantastic variety of ways in which you can just slap fools down. I probably wouldn't necessarily go with that. You could go for more passives if you really wanted to. Overguard is a wonderful time. Trying to think. Well, Fighting Spirit wouldn't be. This is one of the few times where Fighting Spirit would be really good, actually. This is one of the builds that I would do this with. So, this particular combination gives you a lot. You don't have to necessarily go into Ravenous Earth. I just really love this ability. But you can drain the enemy and heal yourself. You're doing damage to anybody who hits you. Because, again, just to remind you, this isn't retaliation damage. So before you think to yourself, oh, you could do a great retaliation build, no, sadly, this is not retaliation. Anybody who damages you with a non-spell, be it they shoot you with any kind of projectile weapon, they hit you with anything that isn't magical, they take damage. Period. End of story. Does not matter where they're at, what they hit you with. If it's physical, pierce, I think bleeding, internal trauma, boom. This slaps him in the face. This is fantastic. This is an absolutely fantastic aura, and I love this thing to pieces. This is great. But beyond that, awesome fact, this reduces their resistances and everything. It's just a really great time. This does percentage of health, so that's always amazing. And then you have all of these passives keeping you alive. Now, if the enemy does not resist Vitality and or Aether damage, which unfortunately that describes about half the enemies in the game, they resist one or the other of those. Unfortunately, that's just how it works. There's nothing really you can do about it, and you do have to be aware of that. But in all of the situations, you're unkillable. And if you can get enough stuff, this really depends on what you have and what your constellations are. If you get enough, you can reduce their... Obviously, you're reducing their resistance to some extent here anyways, so you're not as badly off as maybe you would initially think. But if you can get equipment or constellations that reduce their vitality and aether resistance further, you're in an even better position. And even then, if they do happen to resist them more than you can handle, more than you can heal off of them with Drain Essence, that's exactly why you have Ravenous Earth here. Yes, it does some vitality, yes, it does some aether, but it does percentage reduction, and it has Poison Acid out the wazoo. This is fantastic for responding to those, especially since it also reduces the target's damage as well. Reduces their resistances further, so maybe you are reducing their resistances at that point to use Decomposition, maybe. But this, if you play this right, and you're at least... and either you already have the equipment you need, or you're lucky enough to get it while you're building up to this, while you're building up to level 100, you're basically unkillable. Again, this depends upon the enemies you're fighting, which is the only reason why I don't rate this higher than Soldier, Arcanist, and Defense. So this is unkillable asterisk, as long as they don't resist you too much. You do have fallback, don't get me wrong. You have Menhir's Will, you've got Overguard, you've got the shield. Again, if you use the shield, you don't have to. But for pure tankiness, you're going to be using a shield, obviously. But you have all these fallbacks that you can work on. So it is one of the most effective builds I have played, broadly speaking. It basically has an answer to every situation. It's not particularly concerned with surprises or anything like that. It basically looks in the face of danger and laughs, which is great. And Fighting Spirit, of course, this is one of the few builds I like Fighting Spirit with, because this will just activate randomly whenever you're getting hit while you're draining this health. So even if you're not necessarily draining enough health initially, maybe you're doing too little damage, whatever, every time they hit you, you have a 40% chance of quadrupling the amount of damage, and therefore the amount of healing you're doing. That doesn't even include criticals, by the way, and that's just a really magical time. So it's one of the very few builds where I will say, yeah, Fighting Spirit is fantastic, please put this on. Usually it's too inconsistent for me to care, but in this particular circumstance, you're standing still, you're draining life, and since you are standing still, you're not going to be moving, and you are draining that life, you will be absorbing hits. And in that circumstance, since you're standing there absorbing hits and dealing damage and trying to heal, the amount of times that Fighting Spirit activates are going to be often enough where you will notice it increasing your damage. You will notice it having a extremely large effect, and that works great with Spectral Wrath and Spectral Binding, which will also help keep you alive, not only by increasing your health, but slapping enemies in response to any kind of damage you're taking at the same time. And again, Ravenous Earth I only put in there for any enemies that are particularly resistant to Aether and Vitality. It's basically your plan B should an enemy prove undrainable for resistance reasons. That's what it's primarily there for. Or as a good entry into a fight in which there is an abnormally large number of enemies, there is, if I had to describe one flaw of Drain Essence, it's that even though you can absolutely nab multiple targets with this, you have a chance of affecting up to 4 targets, which is not exactly consistent. So there is a small problem here with groups, and Ravenous Earth is a great response to enemy groups. And then you bust out the Drain Essence on the individuals, or, you know, whatever. Maybe you bust out a Ravenous Earth to take out the smaller enemies, focus down the boss or the hero or what have you with Drain Essence. It usually works out really well. And then, you know, anybody who survives the initial Ravenous Earth, Fell Eruption, what have you, is going to get killed by Spectral Wrath, generally speaking. So you do have that option. And it's fantastic. It is absolutely amazing. And especially since you're draining even more with this. So actually, at the end of the day, I think this comes out to like... How much does this come out to? 20% minimum. And I can't even calculate. Without any kind of equipment, I can't really tell you specifically how much you could be draining, because this is all just going to be the minimum numbers, but it's still a very impressive amount, especially if when you're draining 20% of the damage you're dealing. It's a pretty magical time. So, you have that. Alternatively, you can go into a really interesting Cadence build, where you're using Markovian's Advantage, you're using Cadence, you're using all these passives, of course. Hold on. You're using Reaping Strike, and follow me along here. This is a very interesting build, but it's not the most effective build I've ever played, but it's a pretty fun time. Go into this, and then at that particular point, you're basically running almost entirely... Well, I usually slap on Ravenous Earth because I just really love this ability. Yes, I do have a problem. Don't judge me. And then I'm going to go into these. Or if I'm using a shield, I'm going to go into shield training instead. We'll prototype with the veterancy just for kicks, but you've got the physical damage here, you've got the physical damage and plus 125% all damage here, you have vitality and aether damage here, you're doing that here again with this, you're using this for the enemy groups, you're basically just running a straight up regular, and you would want to pull points out of this one into probably Harbinger of Souls, usually, is what I do. Just pull 10 points out of here, or 12 points, or whatever, and then slap it into Harbinger of Souls. If you wanted these as well, you could absolutely pull all the way back. If you wanted to be really dedicated to this, you could pull all the way back here, grab a Harbinger of Souls, grab Shield Training, grab Overguard, and then single point into Fighting Spirit, just for it. Or maybe a point into one of these two, just for the solely for the stats. Well, this one's already maxed out, but maybe put 1 point here just for the increase in stats, the increase in health mostly, whatever. So this basically is a very cheap. You're basically just auto attacking Ravenous Earth for groups. That's it. It's hyper simple. Oh, groups, Ravenous Earth. Everything else, slap it. That's basically the end of the day. Oh, I'm in danger of dying? Overguard it. You know, that's... If you even use shields. That's about as complicated as it gets. It's very effective. It is very simple. Don't get me wrong, but it is very effective most of the time. There are moments where occasionally you just... The activatable skills here, the default skills aren't activating often enough for you to win a fight. It occasionally happens. It's a bit luck of the draw for me. I don't consistently use it. It is occasionally nice for just mindless fun, really. Or if you really want to keep things concise, maybe you want to play Grim Dawn with just your mouse. Maybe your keyboard is broken. Maybe your keyboard is sketchy. Maybe your sibling is playing some other game that requires the keyboard and all you've got is the mouse for some reason. I don't know what the situation could be. But if for some reason you want to have a build that only uses a mouse, that works. Because you only really need a mouse with enough buttons on it to use a health potion, use an energy potion, activate Overguard, activate Ravenous Earth, activate Harbinger of Souls. You need your left click. You already have your right click. You need just 3 additional buttons. Actually, if you can program your middle mouse wheel and it presses down, if your mouse wheel presses down, boom, that's 3 buttons right there. You need a mouse with 2 buttons, basically, and a pressable mouse wheel. It's great. So, you can do that. Or maybe you, I don't know, maybe you're ambidextrous and you want to draw with one hand and you want to play Grim Dawn with the other one. I don't know how that would work, but let's pretend. But you could absolutely do that as well. So there is that strange idea, admittedly, but you could absolutely do that. There's a bunch of different builds you can do with just your mouse, if it has enough buttons on it. But yeah, you could just go with a full-on, nice, pure, simplistic auto-attack build. Actually, it would need 6 buttons. I just realized you would have to turn on Spectral Wrath, but that's fine. You could also just go down there and click on the auras, too. So I suppose you only need, technically, right and left click, mouse wheel, button down, single extra button, whatever. But there is that. Now, you may have noticed, this whole time, I have almost not at all talked about the soldier active skills. There's a reason for this. Primarily, you won't be using these because for the most part, there is almost nothing in Necromancer that increases soldier skills. The only ability you would pull out of Necromancer is Spectral Binding plus Spectral Wrath. That's it. Maybe you're feeling ambitious. You want to splash in more Aether Vitality? You go Reaping Strike. You go Drain Essence. Maybe. This is purely up to you. But you could do this. Pull all these points out down to the 20. Put everything else into Soldier. These are the only 3 skills, if you're going with a physical damage build, that I can justify you using. And even then, I don't see really a heavy use for Decomposition. For the whole Drain Essence line, I don't really see that much use out of this in light of Spectral Wrath. Reaping Strike, sure. In a pure, even if you're going really heavy into the physical, if you're building Spectral Binding, keep in mind that Reaping Strike is also increasing your weapon damage, which, as long as it's a physical weapon, Reaping Strike will be doing a certain amount of physical damage. Don't worry about it. That will pull through. You could also theoretically justify Necrotic Edge as well. I'm much less fond of this particular one. I don't find the cold damage in a physical build here does enough. It's not being helped out by a Spectral Wrath, unlike Reaping Strike. So I very rarely utilize Necrotic Edge. Usually Reaping Strike is what I'll stick with, and then I'll use whatever physical abilities I really feel like going with. Almost always Cadence, in this particular case. It really works well with Reaping Strike. If Reaping Strike happens to activate on the 3rd strike, oh, that's just delicious. And I'll go into my passives and my physical damage and whatever, but that's about all you will pull from here. So keep that in mind. Now, what do I recommend? What are the skills that at the end of the day you should always consider? Well, let's start with the Soldier, because you probably know by now. But if you guessed Cadence, Menhir's Will, and Veterancy? I'm sorry, Military Conditioning. Veterancy is this one, isn't it? Yeah. If you were thinking this, and this, you're correct. These work great with pretty much anything that you put the Soldier with, as you've probably figured out by now. There are a couple of occasions where some specific ability is a little bit more geared, or fits a little bit better with a specific combination. But overall, even though this isn't the last Soldier combination we'll be looking at, there's one more. It is important to point out that Cadence is almost never a bad choice. You can usually switch this around or customize this to whatever, if you have the right weapon. Now keep in mind, and this is something that I have not talked about at all previously, in either of my walkthroughs or in any of these class examinations, or even the tier list, but that 130% weapon damage is increasing whatever damage your weapon is doing. And if you've been paying attention, you will have noticed that a lot of weapons, actually, don't limit themselves to physical damage. Cadence, if you are going heavy into Necromancer, but you want Cadence, and you want to take advantage of Harbinger of Souls, you equip a weapon that does vitality damage. That's it. That is it. If your weapon does a specific damage type, that plus 420% weapon damage is going to be that damage type. Whatever damage type your weapon is doing, does not matter. It will enhance that. It's great. So Cadence, in pretty much any given build, will work. There is not a single build in which I have regretted building Cadence. The only real exception to this is if you're Shaman, or Demolitionist, or... I'm having a brain cramp. Shaman, Demolitionist, or... Why am I having a problem with this? Or, Oathkeeper. That's the one. If you're Shaman, Demolitionist, or Oathkeeper, they each also offer an ability that increases or replaces the default weapon attack. Maybe you pick Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor, or whatever it's called, from Oathkeeper, or you pick Savagery for some specific build reason. You have a weapon that enhances that ability, whatever. Occasionally I'll deviate out into one of those, but Cadence is very tried and true for everyone else. It will absolutely work with pretty much any given class, again, as long as you're equipped with the right weapon. And yes, if you were to equip a vitality damage weapon with Cadence and you have Harbinger of Souls is increasing that damage, and the physical damage from Cadence is being converted into vitality damage. It's a pretty good time. Cadence works. Cadence almost always works. And again, many heroes will, almost always works. I'm really fond of two-handed melee weapons with this combination. You don't feel like you have to. There are many fantastic shields for this combo, but I usually use two-handed melee. Military conditioning, never a bad choice. More health? Please, give me more of that. I love health injected straight into my blood veins. That came out weird. But this is always also good. Now, some people will say Markovian's advantage, and in this particular class combination, yes, this can work very well. But a lot of the times, I personally feel it doesn't activate quite as often. I almost never bust out Zul'Hans, unless I'm really focused on doing internal trauma damage. Like, my build is focused around physical internal trauma. Like, if I'm going to build Olorun's Rage, I'll consider Zul'Han's technique. But a lot of the times, again, I just find it too inconsistent. I find Fighting Spirit too inconsistent. I find Markovian's advantage too inconsistent. But this combination can actually use, at the very least, Markovian's advantage and Fighting Spirit pretty well overall. Either you can use Markovian's advantage, mix it with the Reaping Strike, that's a pretty good time, what have you, whatever. Just like with the Inquisitor can really put Markovian's advantage, Markovian's advantage into a pretty good position. Same thing here. But yes, for Soldier, those are the big skills. And also you learn something new about Cadence's weapon damage, if you didn't know that before. But for Necromancer, really, you almost always will want to be building this with this combination. Because even if you decide to go with physical damage, unless you're going so heavy into pets you can't spare the points, this skill combination is amazing. This is always worth considering. Always. With this combination. There are some combos where this is substantially less useful. As a fantastic example, a popular combo would be Necromancer Occultist. This I usually don't build Spectral Wrath on. Sometimes I'll go into Spectral Binding. Sometimes with, not Occultist. Sometimes I'll go into Spectral Binding with either Inquisitor, if I'm going with a heavy Aether build, or with Arcanist, obviously. A couple of other choice, very specific scenarios, I'll go into Spectral Binding, but most of the time, no. But, yeah, for this combination, Spectral Wrath is always at least worth considering. Another one that's always at least worth considering, and this is true of Necromancer regardless of what you put with it, Ravenous Earth. Again, I love this ability. I love Ravenous Earth. It's one of my absolute favorite abilities. This and Bloody Pox are two of my favorite abilities. This is always worth considering, especially for Necromancer as a response to things that are normally resistant to the rather interesting combination of Aether and Vitality. The number of enemies that resist one or the other is very high. And Ravenous Earth spits in their face. And that's a good thing. So, Ravenous Earth, again, always worth considering. Spectral Binding, always worth considering. Reaping Strike, always worth considering. Again, if you want to do a particular damage type, Reaping Strike increases weapon damage. Works really well with Spectral Wrath. This is actually the reason this is the reason why I don't normally build Necrotic Edge, nor do I normally recommend building Necrotic Edge, again, unless it fits so perfectly into your build. For example, Necrotic Edge tends to be very good with Nightblade, just as a random shout-out, as an example, but usually Reaping Strike is the better of the two, because it works with Spectral Wrath. If I want to go into Harbinger of Souls, it works really well with that, even though it is inconsistent in its activation because of the various internal supports in the Necromancer class. When it does activate, if you're building correctly, it hits like a steam engine, and it's always worth the inconsistency, because in the long run, despite its inconsistency, if it's properly supported, it's easily outpacing a lot of your other damage options, at least for the Necromancer class, in terms of single target damage. Actually, you may notice that there's not a whole lot of single target abilities in this setup. Sure, to some extent you have a percentage chance of affecting multiple targets with Drain Essence. So Drain Essence is single target usually, but beyond that, this isn't technically single target unless you're going with Harvester of Death. Pets do whatever they want. Mark of Torment is single target quotes, but yeah, for this class, Reaping Strike is your primary source of, well, one of your two primary sources of single target damage in this build, so it does tend to be useful. But what separates this obviously from Drain Essence is the fact that if you equip a weapon that does a damage type that isn't Vitality or Aether, you're mixing that into the Reaping Strike, and it can pull its weight regardless of what class you put it with. So, regardless of what you're building, these three abilities are, for this combination, always worth sitting down and considering adding to your build. Always worth a thought. So, I spent a long time on this one because this is one of my favorite combinations to just play around with again. Not my absolute favorite, but it is one that I come back to often for a good time. Just a good few laughs. There's some pretty crazy things you can do with this combination. But I do really recommend this combination. It is a good time. Despite the relatively limited crossover, again, that really is going to depend a lot on what items you have as well. Some will really help these mesh together really well. But with that being said, thank you all very much for listening and or watching. And if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, whatever, please leave them down in the comments below. I will read them. And have a great 24 hours.